All right, let's go ahead and get started. Start with my freshman year of college. We're going to talk about the soul, and has science disproved the soul? What is a soul? Freshman year of college, I took a class from an atheist professor for my first class, and there's a story behind that. But after my first semester, I really enjoyed it. I was able to ask questions, whereas in my youth groups, I'd get in trouble for asking questions. And I wanted to take another class in philosophy, but everybody told me and warned me, if you're going to take another class in philosophy, do not take Professor Pino's class, because if you take his class, you will lose your faith. I said, sign me up. Not because I wanted to lose my faith, but because I had a genuine curiosity about a few things. And I knew that, in my mind, if Christianity was true, I needed to know why. But by the same token, if Christianity was false, I still needed to know why, and perhaps this was a guy for the job. To give an example of what class was like, he walks in one day, and he pretends like he's holding up an antidepressant pill. And he says, now religion wants us to believe in something like a soul. And because of this, we can have hope in an afterlife and seeing our family and friends who've passed away and being with them in heaven and whatnot. He said, but the thing is, according to Christianity and religion, your soul is something that's not physical. It's something in which your moods and your emotions and your feelings are contained in your soul, and those things aren't physical either. He said, but the problem is that how is it that if I took this antidepressant pill, which is physical, it would change the effects and emotions and moods in my soul? How can something tiny that is physical affect the allegedly non-physical? Because the problem is, every time we look at the brain, all we see are neurons firing, and every time we look at the body, we just see the base elements of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, but you never find anything like a soul. Why is that? How would you explain that, he said. And then he said, well, I'll tell you why. It's a really simple explanation. The answer is simple. It's because there is no soul, there is no heaven, there is no God, there is no afterlife. You're just a physical brain and body, a meat machine, and we need to learn to live with this fact and get on with our lives and stop believing in these foolish fairy tales. See you next week in class. How would you respond to something like that? I was a freshman in college. Not only had I met someone that did not believe in the soul, I had never heard an objection raised against it. In a longer presentation that I give, we talk a little bit more about what this is. It's what the Bible would call a stronghold in a DVD I have called Spiritual Warfare, where the Bible talks about certain strongholds. A few of the other speakers mention things like perhaps something naturalism, that the physical world is all there is. But I want to focus merely on what is the soul. Naturalism is a view that there is nothing non-physical that exists. And there's different variations of it, but we'll go with that for now. And not only is it a problem in our society and culture, I want to show you how this has crept into our churches. Do me a favor. Point to what part of your body thinks. Okay, yes, okay. So, your brain thinks. Question, do you need a brain to think? Okay, yes. Does God have a brain? We're not Mormons, so the answer would be no, right? Because he does not have a physical body. He is spirit. Okay. Does God think? Absolutely. The Psalm says that his thoughts towards us are more than the grains of sand. So, are you made in his image? Yeah. Hey, do you need a brain to think? Now, how is it that we come to a culture where you grow up and no matter what school you go to, it's as if there's this separation of, quote, church and state. So what they want to do is they want to be neutral. And instead of being neutral, they actually end up going to the opposite end of the spectrum. And rather than being neutral, what they do is they reduce everything to something physical. So you go to a school and you learn that it is your brain that thinks. And then you go to a church and you worship a God and sing songs to a God who has no brain and yet thinks just fine. And we never let these two beliefs meet. I'm reminded of something Christ said in Matthew chapter 5, verse 13, he said that you are the salt of the earth, but if the salt loses its purpose, it's no longer good for anything. So the question becomes, what was the purpose of salt? In biblical times, there were no refrigerators. So what you would do is you would add salt to meat as a preservative. It would be a way to prolong the life of the meat. But what Christ is essentially saying with this verse is that let's suppose you have this salt that you've bought at the store and you keep applying it to different aspects and various pieces of meat, but you find that the meat is not prolonged by a day longer. It keeps going bad. Now, biblically speaking, who is the salt of the earth? Us, the church. What does the meat represent? The world. Let me ask you, is the meat going bad? Absolutely. Turn on any news media outlet you'd like. But the point that Christ is getting at here is that if at some point, although you add salt to meat, but the meat is not preserved and it keeps going bad, then at some point you're going to have to stop asking and pointing your fingers at the meat. And you're going to have to stop asking what's wrong with the meat. And at some point you're going to have to step back and ask yourself what's wrong with the salt. Yeah. See if that closes now. I don't want to trip over that. Now, in this stage of my life, it was a bit difficult because there were some things I was wrestling with. And I one time was sharing this story with someone and talking about the need for apologetics, and one youth pastor said, well, Eric, my students don't have those kind of questions. Depending on how many prayers I've said that day, depends on how I answer when someone says something like that. But sometimes I might say, well, it's that kind of attitude that almost pushed me away from the church, because I had those questions, and there were people that were with that same type of attitude that gave me the same type of response. And it did nothing for me. And it's not a question of whether or not your students will have these questions or a matter of whether or not they do have questions overall. I assure you, anyone in your life that thinks seriously about their faith is going to have these type of questions. It's not a matter of whether they have these questions. It's rather a matter of whether or not they're comfortable enough to ask you those questions. Because if they have these questions and they're not asking you, it says more about our attitude towards their questions than whether or not they have those questions in the first place. Are you with me? But, Eric, it's all about faith. We don't really need this apologetic stuff. I know this doesn't apply to this church. I'm talking about the other church I passed up down the road, down there. They came to Christ and they said, what is the greatest commandment? Out of all the commandments in the Old Testament, which one is the greatest? Usually at this point, I make a joke, but I like you guys, so I don't want to do that here. I'll make the joke. What I usually say is, how many commandments are in the Old Testament? Because they ask Christ, out of all the commandments, how many are in the Old Testament? People usually say 10, and I say, close enough, 613. Out of all 613 commandments, he said the greatest is to love the Lord God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength. That word mind literally means your intellect, your way of understanding, your faculty of reasoning. And I'm not saying we need to neglect the other two things. I think we do a fair job of loving God with our heart. We get emotional. I think we do a fair job of loving God with our strength. We volunteer at the bake sale. It's fantastic. But then there's loving God with the mind. I'm saying let's not neglect this, because they are all three aspects of loving God with your entire self. But he also says loving God with the soul. Maybe he didn't take my professor's class. Let's jump right into this. Because as you heard earlier, there's been talk about the resurrection, and Paul said that if the resurrection didn't happen, Christianity is false. Now, at this time in my life when I heard this objection towards the soul, it really struck a nerve in me. It really struck a chord in the sense that it really took me back to where I just kind of sat there for a little bit to chew on that. Because I knew that Paul said if there is no resurrection, Christianity can't be true. But in other words, if you don't have a resurrection, you can't have a church, you can't have a Christianity. But at the same time, if there is no soul, then by the same token, there can be no resurrection. And once again, if there's no resurrection, there can be no Christianity. So obviously, this would be something that is a huge, important issue. What is a soul? For the sake of time, I want to go through this. Maybe I can get into more other things later. Some other questions I might throw at you. But let's go ahead and get into some definitions. The soul, we're going to define as an immaterial substance that contains consciousness and animates the body. Just as a preface, or a disclaimer rather, we're going to get really heavy into some philosophy. That's what it takes to, I think anytime you think deeply about God, it's going to require some type of philosophy. I did a 2-hour debate on the existence of the soul that we have back there, and then we did a commentary afterwards on the debate on how it went. But I remember this atheist about a week before the debate said, I'm really excited about this debate because, and then he quoted Paul, if there's no resurrection, Christianity can't be true. He said, but it's really easy to disprove Christianity. You just have to show the resurrection didn't happen. He said, but it's even easier than that, because if you can show there's no soul, then you get the whole thing and Christianity is not true. We're going to focus on two things, aspects of what the soul is. And we're going to break it down because to demonstrate the existence of the soul, I think it's relatively easy, but it's not simple, if that makes sense. There's only two basic points you'd have to demonstrate to show that the soul exists. One is to show that consciousness is not physical. The second point would simply be to show that I am more than my brain and body, and based on those two, you can conclude I am a soul. So it's really easy, two basic points to demonstrate that the soul exists. My consciousness is not physical. I am more than my brain and body. Therefore, I am a soul. Now, you might think, well, how would we go about understanding these things? How do we go about investigating these things? What I usually hear is I've had people say, can you show me any scientific evidence for God or show me any scientific evidence for the soul? Because science is where we need to turn to. If science can show it, then we can know it. But I submit to you that actually science is the worst thing we can use for this kind of thing. Let me explain why. Suppose you call your neighbor and you say, I'm kind of worried, concerned right now because there's an invisible man in my house. And your neighbor, being the very skeptic that he is, says, okay, let me go investigate, because I don't know if I believe you. You say, yes, please, come on in. Come check if you want. There's an invisible man in my house. So your neighbor comes in, and he thinks he's going to see whether or not there is an invisible person in your house. But an hour later, he comes out, and he's really upset with you. And he says, I don't believe you. Why are you lying to me? Why are you wasting my time? You say, what do you mean? He says, there's no invisible guy in your house. You say, yes, there is. He said, there's not. I checked. I said, well, how do you know there's not? He said, well, because I looked everywhere. I looked in the basement. I looked in your closet. I looked under your bed. I looked in your bathroom. And not once did I ever see this invisible man, so you must be lying to me. What would be wrong with an objection like that? Well, of course, you wouldn't see him because he's invisible, right? Now, that doesn't prove that there is an invisible man. What it does prove is that if you wanted to disprove the existence of an invisible man, you cannot appeal to your sense of visibility to disprove something that by definition cannot be visible. In other words, if you're going to use science is a wonderful tool for investigating the physical natural world, but if the soul exists, by definition, it is not physical. So you cannot investigate something that only studies the physical to try and look and research something that is non-physical. This is what you call in philosophy a category fallacy. As professor of philosophy of science Michael Ruth said, science does not ask certain questions, so it is to no surprise it does not give certain answers. Because if anything, to use the science to measure something like a soul would be like trying to use a ruler to measure your weight. It is simply the wrong tool for the assessment. You cannot use a ruler to measure your weight, and you cannot use a scale to see how tall you are. These are not the same tools, they're different categories. When it comes to the soul, we don't turn to science, we turn to what's called metaphysics. It's a branch of philosophy. Now, in order to establish these 2 points we talked about, we're going to have to just unpack a very, very important key principle in all this, known as, the long name is Leibniz's law of the indiscernibility of identicals, but to keep it short, we're going to call it the law of identity. And within the law of identity, we're going to use that to unpack these 2 points that are going to be relatively simple. To understand the law of identity, you simply have to understand this. According to the law of identity, if 2 things in question are the same, let's say A and B, we don't know what they are, but if they're the same thing, then by default, they're going to share the same properties. Now, at the same time, if 2 things that you may be questioning of whether or not they're identical, and in philosophy, identical means literally the same thing, but in principle, if you can find something true of one that is not true of the other and vice versa, then they cannot be the same thing. Are you with me? Here's an example. Suppose you walk into a lab and you see 2 bottles of clear fluid, and you want to know, are they the same substance? One is labeled water, let's say the other is chemical X, or let's say it's scratched off, you can't read the label. Well, you begin to investigate and you find that they're both clear fluids. So you say, well, they both have the property of being a clear fluid, perhaps they're the same thing. Until you turn over the bottle labeled chemical X and it says caution flammable. And you think, well, I know that water's not flammable. Therefore, even if I don't know what chemical X is, at the very least I can know that they are not the same thing. We good? Now, when we look at this, we're going to look at the first point, consciousness is not physical. Now, what is consciousness? Again, this is going to take a little bit more terminology here. Bear with me. Consciousness is one of those things that you define what's called ostensibly, meaning you point to an instance or an example of it. If I were to ask you to define the color purple, how would you do it? Right, you'd have to say, well, this. If I say, what is blue? I say this right here. I'm pointing to an example or instance. So those are things that are defined ostensibly. Consciousness is the same way. Consciousness, or the mind, consists of 5 different states. Much like water could exist in 3 states, solid, liquid, and gas, consciousness is one of those things that has 5 states to it. So the mind would consist of 5 states, namely thoughts, beliefs, sensations, desires, and acts of will. And I'm going to keep it on the time because I don't want, if I go too deep, we'll spend too much time on one thing. Now, how do we know there's 5 states? Again, it would take longer to go into it, but as an example, I know, for example, that my thoughts and beliefs are not the same thing because they share different properties. How so? Well, I can have thoughts I don't believe, and I can believe things that I'm not currently thinking. So they have different properties, so they share different things, hence they're separate individual states. Now, the law of identity. Remember what my professor said, that allegedly because this pill can affect the states in my mind, then my mind must be nothing more than my brain. It's a reducing concept. But if it's true, we have to actually look at the law of identity. And if these are two the same thing, then whatever's true of one must be true of the other. But once again, if in principle we can show that they have different properties, even if it's just one, we can show they're not the same thing. Now, I was talking to an atheist once, and he held to a view that there is nothing non-physical that exists, everything's simply physical. Because if all you have is a naturalistic process of evolution that brought us together to who we are, then all you have is physical matter interacting with more physical matter, and all you get is complicated chunks of matter, but you don't get anything non-physical. Right? Physical will beget physical. Now, if that's the case, I was talking to an atheist once, and I said, let me ask you a question. Would you agree with me that if atheism is true, then we should not expect anything non-physical to exist? I said, yeah, I think that's fair. Like no angels, demons, spirits, nothing like that, just physical. He said, yes. I said, okay, got him. That's all I needed. I said, well, that would also mean, though, if something non-physical did exist, then that would entail by default, then atheism can't be true, based on what we've established. He said, okay, sure, I can see that. That's fair. I said, all right. Let's put it this way. If atheism is true, then consciousness must be reducible to something like the brain. Right? He said, yeah. I said, okay. But if consciousness is not reducible to the brain, and if consciousness is not physical, then that would follow that if consciousness exists, atheism can't be true. So the question becomes, is consciousness physical? Well, let's find out. What do we use? Law of identity. If the mind is the same thing as the brain, nothing more than the brain, then whatever's true of the mind is going to necessarily be true of the brain, and vice versa. But again, if we can find something true of one that's not true of the other, they're not the same thing. And it's very easy to do. My mind, which contains my thoughts can be true or false, right? But you can't open up my skull and look at my brain and say, now this part right here is true, but this part over here is false. Doesn't make sense. My brain can weigh 3 pounds, but my thought that I'm here with you guys today doesn't weigh 3 pounds. You may be having heavy thoughts throughout this morning, but you're not going to go buy a neck brace because your thoughts don't have weight like that. They're not the same thing. They're not nothing physical. My brain can be 7 inches long, but the smell of a rose or the taste of banana, which is in my mind, is not 7 inches long. It makes no sense to say that my taste of banana is 7 inches long. How long is yours? These are category fallacies. Now, I can give a dozen more, but I was talking with this atheist. I said, now I can give a dozen more examples, but the point is clear. If all the properties of the brain are physical and all the properties of the mind are not physical, then it follows that if consciousness exists, it can't be physical. So, Mr. Atheist, if you're conscious and you know that consciousness exists and it's not physical, then quite frankly, you shouldn't be an atheist. And that was his response as well. But, Eric, time out. What about what your professor said about these interactions between the brain and taking these pills? Perhaps even someone's asked, what about brain trauma or Alzheimer's? If you deteriorate parts of the brain, you can lose things like your memory. Does that not prove that they're one and the same? Really quick, my position, which we're going to get into later, so maybe I'm jumping ahead, but your thoughts are not in your brain, they're in your mind, and these are two different things. Now, what about this stuff, though? Does this prove affecting my brain, changing moods or emotions in my mind? Does that prove that they're the same thing? No. Here's why. Because cause or dependence is not the same thing as identity. Let me explain that. Suppose I'm the greatest guitar player, which I'm not. I don't even play guitar. But suppose that I am, and I pop a string on my guitar. Because of this, I will be unable to play perhaps certain music or a certain song. Now, does it follow that because my ability to convey my musical talent through an instrument, does it follow that therefore because of this, I am a guitar? No, of course not. But suppose I popped another string and then it inhibited me. I could no longer play the note C. Does it follow from this that therefore the note C is inside the guitar? That if a worship leader were to come play and he's about to start and he says, guys, time out. Actually, I dropped my note C. It must be in my trunk. Let me go grab it real fast before we can start. No, of course not. So although we can establish that playing a guitar or playing music with a note C, we can show that there is a causal or dependent relationship between the two. That's fine. But it does not follow that just because there's a causal or dependent relationship that therefore they are the same thing. All that follows is that there's an interaction between them. In the same way, I have no problem saying that things like Alzheimer's or antidepressants or messing with my neurology could affect my states of my mind. There's no problem with that. But all this does is that it does not show it's a cause or it does not show identity. It simply shows there's a cause and effect relationship. And hence, just because you can show that messing with my brain can affect my thoughts or my moods or my behavior, just because you can show the causal dependent relationship does not establish that the mind is the same thing as the brain, because once again, I repeat, causal dependence is not the same thing as identity. You with me? Two heads nod. Good. Okay. So, consciousness is not physical. There's a lot more we can go through, but we know that they're not the same thing. It's not physical. Now, here's the next problem. What we talked about were like properties and states of the mind. Now, properties would be something like being red. Their characteristics or attributes. Being red is a property. Being triangularity is a property. Now, the thing is that properties don't just float around in the world by themselves. Like redness. When you get on the road today, you're not going to drive and be cautious, and you're not going to say, hey, don't hit redness. Watch out, because redness just might fall right in front of you. You don't fear hitting redness. If anything, you will be cautious of hitting something that possesses a property of being red, which is to say that properties are necessarily owned or possessed by something else. Pizza slices possess the property of being triangular. Balls can be red. Water can be wet. So these properties are owned by something. That being said, the properties of my mind are owned by something. Something possesses consciousness. Here's a profound thought. Think about this. Thoughts have thinkers. Imagine that. Thoughts don't float around by themselves. Anytime there's a thought, it's owned by a thinker. Now the question becomes, what owns consciousness? What possesses consciousness? Well, I know for certain one thing at least possesses consciousness, and that's me, because I know that I'm conscious. In fact, in order for me to even doubt my very existence, I have to first exist. So I know I'm conscious. But now the question becomes, but what am I? Hence our second point. Now, I'm what you would call a substance dualist, and we'll define that as the view that I am a soul that has a brain and body. Let me make this clear. I literally am my soul. I am a soul. I have a body. In other words, I don't, quote, have a soul. I am a soul, and hence, a body that does not have a soul would simply be a corpse. So the soul is a self. You are a soul. You don't have a soul. You are a soul. You have a body. And to be honest with you, I've actually recently changed my position on this not too long ago, because I actually do have a soul, and it's out there. It's orange. It's a Kia Soul. And I literally bought that car so I could make this joke, and it's worth every penny. Funny thing, I really did, I like the color orange. I was at a gas pump one time, and I was putting in gas, and somebody's like, hey, I like the car, I like the color. I'm like, thanks. He's like, so why'd you get it? Is it a good car? I'm like, yeah, I like it. How many miles does it get? I'm like, I'm not sure. Well, how much does it have? I'm like, I'm not really sure. He's like, well, why'd you get the car? I said, well, funny story. So for the next 20 minutes, I actually started witnessing to this guy when I started talking about this, and then we started talking about church and God and the soul, and he's like, hey, would you mind, coming to a church nearby for us? I'd love to hear more about this. So that was actually pretty cool. So go buy a soul maybe, I don't know. My soul's great. So we can put it this way. So if I am my soul, and my soul is a material, by definition, and that would then follow that I am immaterial. And if my brain and body are nothing more than something physical, then it would follow that if I am material and my brain and body are physical, if this is true, then it follows that I cannot be identical to my brain and body. Now, we haven't argued for this yet. I'm just setting the stage for it. Let's get into this. Now, same thing, law of identity. There are three arguments we can give for how we know that you are more than a brain and body. Because if I am nothing more than a brain and body, if that's all I am, is just a brain and body, I'm going to bring this on this side, then I would be what philosophers would call a mereological aggregate. For short, we're going to call it aggregate later, but if you want to impress somebody later, say, yeah, we learned about mereological aggregates in church today. It was great. People think you're really smart. We can define this as a collection of separable parts held together in a certain structure. Now, things like watches, cars, things like, watches, cars, and Legos are what you would call aggregates. They are a collection of separable parts held together in a certain structure. Now, here's the thing about aggregates. Physical objects are aggregates, and they are different from living objects because, for example, let's take a tricycle. For aggregates, its existence and identity is necessarily dependent on its parts and its structure. What do I mean by that? If you take a tricycle and you remove a wheel from a tricycle, it is now a what? Bicycle. Which means that for purely physical objects, their existence and identity depends on their parts, and when you change their parts, you change what they are. Does that make sense? So, that's a characteristic of an aggregate. Here's a thought experiment. Take this car here. I don't own that one. I own the soul of that one. I couldn't afford that one. If you change the wheels on a car, the tires on a car, is it still the same car? Just chew on that for a minute. Here's another question. Suppose not only do you change the tires on the car, but let's suppose after a year or so, you change every single nut and bolt in this car. Everything that's on it, you give it a good shine. Is it still the same car? Before you answer that even again, let's suppose you take all the parts you replace, put those back together. Now you have two cars, and the question becomes, which one of these two is the original? Now, despite your answer, no matter what you answer, there's one point that's at least clear. They both can't be the original, right? And why is that? Because for aggregates, they do not maintain what's called identity through change. You replace the parts or structure of an aggregate, you change what it is. With this in mind, here's the first argument known as the argument from identity through change. Because it's quite simple. You are either a purely physical object, an aggregate, or you're an immaterial soul. Which one are you? Well, if I'm a purely physical object, then you would not retain identity through change. So, the question is, which one of these two are you? Well, it depends. Do you maintain identity through change? Suppose I commit a crime 10 years ago. They say that every 7 to 10 years you replace virtually almost every cell in your body. Suppose 10 years ago I committed murder, and if you're watching, I'm not confessing to anything. I didn't. For the sake of argument, let's suppose I did. And let's say 10 years later after I committed the crime, a detective comes to my house, knocks on my door and says, Eric, we're going to have to take you in. We found evidence that, you're guilty of this. And I say, look, officer, I know you think I did it, but let's be honest with you. We're just really physical machines, and we're aggregates. And that was about 10 years ago. So it wasn't me that did it. It was some other guy 10 years ago. Go find him, but good luck he doesn't exist because all those parts have ceased. Now, obviously, if I said that, he's not going to take me very seriously. I'm going to leave in handcuffs. But if I am the same person that I was 10 years ago, in the literal sense, as in, it's not as if somebody ceased to exist and somebody else came to exist. If I'm that same person throughout change and part replacement, then it follows that if I do maintain identity through change, then from that we know that therefore I am not a purely physical object, and given the first premise, the two choices, it must follow that therefore I am a soul. Second point, second argument, indivisibility of personhood. I am either a purely physical object or an immaterial soul. Again, same premise. What time do we start so I can give another time? 3? Okay, excellent. Purely physical objects can be divided in common percentages or degrees. Now, to understand this, again, a little bit more philosophy. Bear with me here. To understand this, we have to first understand the difference between degreed and non-degreed properties. Here's what I mean by that. A degreed property would be something like being soft or hard. So, degreed properties can be divided, and they can exist in various percentages or degrees. For example, being soft can be softer or harder, and being loud or noise can be louder or quieter. So degreed properties can fluctuate. Okay? Now contrast that with non-degreed properties, and this would be something like that things that can't be divided cannot exist in percentages or degrees. Take the property of being even. The number 2 and the number 6 are non-degreed properties. What does that mean? Well, they're both even, but it makes no sense to say that the number 2 is more even than the number 6. Or that the number 6 is more even than the number 2. Why not? Well, because being even is a non-degreed property. It is an all or nothing kind of thing. It either is or it isn't, and there is no in between. With this in mind, take a table, for example, which would be an aggregate. If I cut a table in half and I burn one side, it would make sense to say I am left with 50% of a table. But if you cut off my arms and legs or cut my body in half, it would make no sense to say that I am now 50% of a person. You with me? In fact, when it comes to abortion, if we say that the unborn is less developed than I am more mature and developed in my stature and my height, fair enough. But that would assume that human beings are physical objects and that being a person is a degreed property. But if I am a person and a baby is a person, then it doesn't matter how big or little they come, personhood would be a non-degree property if that's the case. Men are usually taller than women or bigger than women, but it doesn't follow that men are more persons than women. But that's only if personhood is non-degreed. There's a symptom known as Dandy Walker syndrome, where people are born with sometimes as little as 10% of a brain, 90% of a brain, where they're literally missing parts and cavities are in their brain. They're born this way. It's called Dandy Walker syndrome. But it doesn't follow from this that they're merely 50% of persons or only 10% persons. They're still fully formed, they're still fully 100% human beings. They have just maybe are missing some forms or missing some functions, but they're still 100% persons. Now, if that's the case, then it would depend. If I'm a purely physical object, then I can be divided, or my personhood could fluctuate. But if not, then it would follow that I cannot be divided or come in percentages or degrees. Being a person is not one of those things where you can say, this guy's more of a person than this. When we think those kinds of ways, we get into issues of abortion, euthanasia, slavery. Well, they're not really persons like we are. But if everybody's created equal in God's image, you are a person, and personhood is not a agreed property. If that's the case, then it would follow that you're not a purely physical object, and therefore you are a soul. And we can put the point differently. I was talking with an atheist online once. You can go on type my name in YouTube. You can see the channel where I've had discussions on this. And I said, does having more mass and matter mean that you matter more? He said, well, no. I said, right, because human beings are not divisible. We're not degraded properties. But if that's the case, then we're more than something physical. We must be a soul. So if you don't think human beings are degraded, if you don't think you have more worth than a woman, then that means you have a soul. And if you have a soul, you shouldn't be an atheist. Quite frankly. Now, a lot more we can go into. I actually did a debate on the radio I have over here. And by the way, we sell the DVDs for like $10. CDs are $5. Even if you only have $1, I don't mind you taking something. As long as you can let me know you'll use it, I don't mind that. All proceeds, by the way, go to Feed a Hungry Family, my hungry family. I have 2 kids, and they eat a lot. I did a debate on an atheist radio show where we talked about the soul and consciousness. And it was a 3-hour debate. Went fantastic, for me at least. About a month after the debate, he actually took the debate off of his website. But prior to this debate, we actually signed a contract where I said, hey, give me an unedited copy of this. So we agreed on that. So when he actually took the debate off his website, I just uploaded it to mine. So if you want it, we have it back there. It's the only place you can get it. Let's go through a third point, and let me check on the time here. Okay. This is the last argument. Free will. Again, let's first define something. What is free will? For the sake of time, free will we'll define as being the original source or first cause of your will or actions. Here's what I mean. You are not caused to act or will by something prior or external to yourself. If I ask you to lift your hand and you do it and nothing caused you, I say, good, you had free will. But if I shock you with a taser and your hand goes up, then you were caused by something external to yourself. You didn't have free will. Suppose there was a murder that happened. Someone once joked one time, says, philosophers come up with like the weirdest examples that are like so bizarre and strange, and it's true. I was outside one time talking to the phone with someone, and we're talking about something like this, and I'm like, yeah, so suppose this person were to like murder this guy and this, and I like, look, and my neighbor's right there. I'm like, okay, I should probably go inside because he probably thinks I'm kind of weird talking about this stuff so casually. Now, if this person shot somebody else and murdered them with a gun, technically, it was actually the bullet that penetrated his heart. But it was technically the bullet that killed him. But do we blame the bullet? Well, no. Why? Because we know that the bullet didn't act on its own. It was caused by the gun. So, okay, let's blame the gun, as some people might. We won't get political there. But actually, no, because we know that the gun had a trigger that was pulled by the person. So what we do is we say, these here are merely secondary causes, whereas this person was the first cause. And because of this, we know that he was the one that started this chain of events, the first mover of these events. And that's why we blame this person, because we know he is the first cause. Now, that being said, again, I'm either a purely physical object or an immaterial soul. Second point, if I am a purely physical object, then I cannot possess free will. Why is that? Well, much like the gun and bullet example. Aristotle once used an illustration. Said, if I move a rock with my staff moved the rock, I moved the staff, but what moved me? Now, if there's no soul, then physicalism is true. You're just something physical. If there's no God, atheism is true. If atheism is true, then the law of causal closure is true. And excuse me, I'm trying to rush here. this would mean that every physical event must have a physical cause. So, in other words, no God, no souls can be involved. Everything that has a cause must be caused by something physical. Okay. Now, I've asked people before, what would move you if you're going to be the first mover? And someone says, well, neurons firing in my brain. Neurons firing in my brain is what caused my staff to move, that caused the hand to move, that caused the rock to move. So therefore, I am still the first cause. It's still something physical. I have free will, and I didn't need a soul. Game over, right? What else do you need to talk about? But actually, not so fast. We have a flag on the field. Why? Because if these things is what caused your hand to move, to cause a staff, to cause a rock, the problem is, based on the law of causal closure, which must be true if atheism is true, we know that every physical event must have a physical cause. And given that we know that if there is no soul, then these things right here are still physical events, and they must be explained by some prior physical event, so you're stuck with the same problem. So you have two options at this point, the person who thinks there is no soul. First option would be to say, okay, let's just say it was caused by another neuron firing. We're good. We're still the first cause. We still have free will. Once again, though, there's a flag. Why? Same problem. Okay, well, let's say another neuron caused that one. Okay, but let's say another neuron caused that one after that, and then another one caused after that. Well, the problem here is that if you keep going backwards, what you're eventually going to find is that you're going to have to go to infinity, and it could actually never happen. Oh, sorry. No, I'm just joking. That's a picture. So this actually can't even happen in principle, which means that in order to get this stuff to happen here, if you're going to say the neuron fired, I'm fine with that. I'm perfectly fine with that. But if there's no God and there's no soul, you're going to have to use something physical to explain that. But as we just saw, this is impossible because it would lead to an infinite regress, which means that the event would never happen. So we have to go to the second option. The second option is going to simply say that at some point, yes, there was a neuron that fired, but you're going to eventually have to say that something prior to yourself is what caused it. But if that's the problem, if that's the case, then the problem becomes that you are no longer the first cause, and if you're not the first cause, you can't have free will. So, that mouthful being said, if I'm a purely physical object, I can't possess free will if there's no soul. Well, if I do possess free will, then it follows that I do have a soul, and hence, if I'm not a purely physical object, I must be a soul. Okay. But an atheist might say, but hold on, I don't agree with you. I don't think we possess free will. I was talking to an atheist once. In fact, I've done this a few times. A few weeks ago, I was talking to someone who was an atheist. He said, well, I don't think we have free will. I said, really? No free will? He said, no. I said, did you freely come to believe that? He said, yes. I said, huh, interesting. He goes, wait. I said, oh, I'm waiting. Now, again, there's a lot to be said here, but what I usually hear atheists say is that I'm a free thinker, right? I'm not bound by the shackles of religion. I'm not brainwashed like some of you religious people are. I'm not shackled by anything like that. People have gone as far as to say, some people are stupid, some are religious, you can't tell the difference. They're free thinkers. But this assumes a type of rational responsibility. In other words, I asked an atheist, are you an atheist because you freely examined the evidence and freely came to your own conclusion? Yes. Okay, so free will exists. No, it doesn't. Okay, then don't take credit for being an atheist. You cannot take credit for freely looking at the evidence any more than you can take credit for your eyes being green, blue, or brown, if you had no free will for it. So this free will of this type would assume rational responsibility. Now, some atheists also say that it's immoral to follow religion, Christianity. It's immoral to do these things. You don't need religion. You need empathy. You need compassion. I don't need a religion. I have a conscience. Hooray for you. And they'll say, we don't need a religion because religion flies planes into buildings. Science will fly you to the moon. Right? There's a difference, allegedly. But they're saying things are immoral. Let's get rid of it. If we can get rid of this stuff, we don't need any kind of religion. Religion is not loving, it's immoral. But again, this all assumes a moral responsibility. Remember what we talked about free will earlier. In order for there to be any kind of responsibility, you must be the first cause. However, if something prior to yourself, as we established, caused you to do all of this, then you actually are not the first cause. You now become a secondary cause. And if you're the secondary cause, again, there can be no free will. So the problem is simple. If the atheist wants to assume that they were rationally responsible for becoming an atheist, And if they want to assume moral responsibility and that Christians shouldn't do bad things, they're going to have to assume free will. But if free will exists, you're going to have a soul, which means if you don't believe in the soul, you cannot believe in free will. And if you can't have free will, you cannot have rational responsibility nor moral responsibility. So again, it is very simple. If you affirm that you are responsible for your thoughts, if you affirm you're responsible for your behavior, you're going to have to affirm that you have free will. And if you have free will, you're not a physical object. You must be a soul. In review, it's important why the Bible commands us to love God with the mind. 2, because if there's no soul, there can be no resurrection. Christianity can't be true. We define the soul as an immaterial substance that contains consciousness, animates the body. We went further to focus on these 2 points, and we saw that the basic points you have to demonstrate is that consciousness is not physical. I am more than my brain and body, hence I am a soul. The arguments we did for the first one was the law of identity. We talked about that. I'm just rushing through this here. We saw this. You can rewind it because it's being recorded. Identity through change, indivisibly a personhood, free will. As we saw with free will, there's 2 things that you have to assume. If you're going to assume these 2 things, you have to have free will. But if there is no free will, you can't have that. If you do have that, you have free will. And if you have free will, then the soul must exist. Again, a lot more to say. We have a debate on the soul that we have back there. It comes with 2 other CDs. On my YouTube channel, if you subscribe, hit that like button, as all the kids say on YouTube these days. Really help us out. There's an interview someone did with me. Did a 2.5-hour interview on the soul where I talk a lot deeper about this stuff. But I encourage you to love God with your mind. Know that there is more to the physical world than just this stuff. We are a spiritual beings. We're not physical beings having spiritual experiences. We're spiritual beings having physical experiences, quite frankly. Because we're made in His image, we have a consciousness. The mind's not physical. We worship a God that has no brain and yet thinks because we're made in His image. We have a soul. Your soul's not physical. It's a beautiful thing. I have a soul out there. If you want to go see it, I'll give you a ride. But to God be the glory, because we are made in His image. And because of that, we can interact, we can think rationally, we can be moral, and we can reach the lost for Christ. Thank you, guys.